We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest, Amie Ninh. She's a diversity, equity, and inclusion program manager at Clever. She's also a DEI consultant and coaching professional at Amie Ninh Coaching and Consulting. Hi, Amie. How are you?
Hi, Christina. Good to be here. I'm doing well.
I'm very excited to start our conversation. You have a lot of experiences that I definitely want to ask about, but just to start off, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and something you're looking forward to?
Yes, definitely. So my name is Amie Ninh. I identify as a cisgender Asian American woman, specifically Vietnamese American. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager at Clever. Clever is the most widely used single sign-on platform for K-12 education. So currently we're used in about 65% of US K-12 schools. And this role is a first for the organization, though I will say Clever has been engaged in DE&I work for a while before hiring this role. And then in addition to my role, as you mentioned, I'm also an equity and anti-racism coach and consultant on the side, working with, other organizations, individuals, whoever is wanting to substantively grapple with equity and anti-racism. I think, to answer your question about, something I looking forward to, I think, honestly, there's been a lot weighing on my heart and mind over the last few weeks, especially given the continued killing of Black and Brown folks at the hands of police, and also the continued, rise of anti-Asian violence. And so, I think what I'm looking forward to when I think about it, I'm really reminded of this quote from Grace Lee Boggs. And I swear this is like the third time this week I've quoted this quote, but it's really bringing me inspiration and just a sense of possibility in the face of so much trauma and pain. And so, and I would just quote Grace Lee Boggs all the time, but the quote is, "Another world is necessary, another world is possible, another world is happening." And so I feel like I am looking forward to what that looks like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you have another one of her quotes potentially on your website as well. I remember that too, which is great. Can you walk us through how you really got into this diversity, equity, and inclusion work and what your pathway was there?
Yeah, I would say it was not the most linear pathway, and I would say that a lot of folks I've talked to in the DEI space, pathways can look totally different. I kind of see my pathway as a bunch of threads weaving together to result in where I am today and result in kind of this moment of realizing that I should be doing this work. And so I'll start from a very personal place, goes all the way back to childhood. I had a really confusing childhood. I grew up in Southern Texas. I was raised by Vietnamese refugees. And from my parents, there was a lot of, not explicit, but a lot of implicit messaging about needing to assimilate into white society in order to be successful. And, because my parents had experienced a ton of racism and discrimination coming to this country, they were just trying to survive. And so that was their way and belief of what it meant to survive. And so, I think that created a really confusing childhood for me, where I was always looking for affirmation. I was always looking to feel like I belonged, and I don't know if I ever did. And it wasn't until I got to college that I started to learn about frameworks and ideas to give voice and validation to my own experiences. So, I took my first ethnic studies course in college when I was 19 years old. And for the first time, I was learning language about many of the things that I had experienced in childhood. I just hadn't thought about it through that frame before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that was kind of the first thread that kicked off this passion for social and racial justice. Post-college, I still putting the threads together, started my career as a teacher. And as a teacher, I think I was really grappling with systemic racism and what my role as an Asian American was in dismantling systemic racism. And I think this is where some of the threads started to come a little bit more together, a little bit clearer, still not entirely there just yet. The job I did after that, so, I pivoted from teaching to actually being a teacher recruiter. And I was working to increase the diversity of our teacher workforce in this country. If you know about our teaching workforce, it is not very diverse. It's 80% white.
Yep.
So it's really important to me to ensure that students had teachers who were from their communities who looked like them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was super passionate about that. And at the same time, I was also really trying to understand cultures and workplaces that lead to inequity, right? I was really realizing that recruiting, while super important, is only one part of the puzzle around DE&I. And you could still recruit a really diverse workforce. You could have a workforce that is representative of the US population, and you could still have very real toxicity, and you could still have a culture that excludes. And I was really thinking about that when I was, in this role, and that kind of led me to move to wanting to do DEI work that was focused on systems change, in particular for people processes, and also working to develop anti-racist learning and development types of experiences. And this was also like, when I realized this was also, 2016, like not necessarily the time in which corporate America has really started to take up the language of systemic racism and privilege and power just yet. So I was realizing it at a time where it was still, I would say, emerging in like a corporate and a tech space. I think we've come a little bit further, I would say, in recent years. And so, now I'm in a role where I'm kind of doing a little bit of everything as it relates to DE&I. I think I stay in this work because I still believe I have a role to dismantle systemic racism. I think everyone has a role, and it's just about figuring out what is that role that you want to play.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. And I appreciate you sharing your personal story as well. I think a lot of people who I've spoken to who are in this work really have lived experiences and also are just really passionate, just outside of their day-to-day job in maybe corporate D&I as well, but also just in everything like a 360 view of their life and the way that they engage with the world as well. I know that when we were talking about this interview too, one of the things that we really wanted to discuss too was the importance of grassroots company culture and what that looks like. Can you tell us your thoughts around that?
Yes, I love grassroots company cultures, and I try to talk about the importance of them as much as I can. So I think about a grassroots company culture in a few ways. One, I think it's where employees feel deeply empowered and feel a strong sense of agency to do something or voice something. I think about it second, where leaders actually listen to what is happening at a grassroots level, and they allow that to potentially inform the organizational decisions that they make around people and culture. And then third, I think it means that, folks and employees can have the agency to start new groups or initiatives from the ground up. And perhaps you don't always need permission from the top to be able to do that. Honestly, these are some of the best work environments and cultures that I've been in, and I've found that employees can really thrive in most cultures like this. That said, I do think it can be the hardest to maintain, and potentially from a leadership perspective, some of the scariest to maintain. But I think it's important that if you have a grassroots culture or any type of grassroots energy in your company, to keep it alive and to ensure that you're sending positive signals to employees at every level of the organization that it's important to maintain.
Absolutely. Employees are observing behavior in more ways than one nowadays as well, especially with the new world of work and what the future of the quote unquote workplace will look like as well. And I think a lot of employees have more to say too, and just like more ways to provide that feedback, whether it's within the company or not. So I also love the idea of grassroots company culture and the empowerment of employees as well to really create an environment that they want to work in and want to thrive in as well. You mentioned earlier that you are the first at Clever for this DEI role, this program manager role, that they've been doing a lot of work since. But can you tell us, just from your opinion, the roles of corporate DEI practitioners and, the strategies there that you've seen?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it generally, and then happy to share more a little bit about the work that we do. But I think from a general sense. So I would say that I very much and deeply believe in the potential of DEI strategies and roles. I think it's great for corporations to invest in DEI work. And honestly, if companies aren't investing in this, it probably will not bode well for them in the future.
Right.
And so I think it is important to have dedicated resourcing to crafting DEI strategy, to have dedicated resourcing around DEI roles. That said, I also think there can be very real pitfalls with DEI strategies and roles. So, DEI roles and departments can sometimes uphold inequities, especially if it's just for show, especially if, the role is just for show, especially if it's just to check a box. I think there was a lot of criticism, especially after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, when all these companies were starting to post DEI roles, questions of like, is this really authentic? And does this company really want to do this? Or is it performative and is it for show? And I will also say, that DEI has been an entire industry for a while. And as an industry, we have a responsibility to move change. I recently read this great book called Diversity Inc. by Pamela Newkirk. And it basically talks about how as a multi-billion-dollar industry, we have not really created transformative change just yet. We have not necessarily moved huge needles. And I think there are a few ways that we can work to change this. So, the first kind of thing that I think about when it comes to DEI strategy is how do we actually look at the system and consider DEI from a lens of systems change?
Right.
I learned how to practice systems thinking from a former manager of mine. And the idea is that essentially every organization is a system and every department, team, and individual is a part of that system. And systems thinking doesn't necessarily mean creating one-off programs or initiatives. It's about how do you understand the forces that are at play in the entire system and work to intervene strategically. And often that's usually a few coordinated and key shifts that can have wide-reaching ramifications as opposed to like 20 different things that you're doing that potentially aren't connected to one another. And so I think about, when we as an industry, how we can move forward this work. That's one way that I think about it. I think the other way is how do we ensure that DEI strategies and as practitioners, our work in DEI is not divorced from history and that we don't take in a historical lens. DEI work, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but it has origins in racial and social justice movements. And, in those movements, we are accountable to the people most marginalized. And I think it's really important to reapply this historical lens to the work and not to see it as just everybody gets along, like we have harmony kind of idea of DE&I. That's not necessarily what my idea of DE&I is. And I'm not sure that idea would lead to the change that I think we want to see in workplaces and as a broader society. So I definitely think about that as kind of another key pillar of what does it mean to move this work forward. I really recommend, if I could make a plug for an article,
Yes.
I really recommend reading. Dr. Kim Tran has this article that came out recently about how the diversity inclusion industry has lost its way. And I think it's a really helpful article to understand a little bit more about the origins, the context, and what do we do about it, especially if we're DEI practitioners and folks who want to actually create change. And like every DEI practitioner and leader that I talk to wants to create change. And it's just about how do we reframe some of the way this work has been done historically. So
Absolutely. And it's about creating that long-standing change and engaging people within the entire system when we're talking about systems thinking to really want to do the internal work too, and then move it forward as well, be culture champions, be DEI champions in themselves. Everybody's in a different part of their journey, but I think that's part of the work too. And folks that I definitely wanted to ask you about specifically too, because I think they're in a unique position to make change maybe a little quicker because of their decision-making seats, but leaders and managers, how do you see their role really playing into this way of thinking, especially from an intersectional like DEI lens as well?
Yes, I think managers and leaders have such a huge and massive role to play. And when you think about systems thinking, managers and leaders are not exempt from this work, and they're not exempt from the forces that happen in a system. I also think, as somebody who, is kind of in a first organizational role around DEI, I know there are other folks in the position, similar positions as well.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that to realize that you cannot rely on one individual to solve everything related to DEI. So, I was very clear. I was very clear coming into my role. Yes, there are things that, I can help add thought leadership on and share my expertise on, and I am one individual, and all of the change work that needs to happen can't just be on me, right? Everyone has to understand their role in this work. We all have a role in perpetuating inequities, and we all have a role in solving the challenge at hand. This is why I talk about systems so much and such a big fan of it. And so I see managers and leaders as having a really hard job. And often that is leading teams and leading people. And we have to consider, it's really hard, but we have to consider management through a lens of equity and inclusion and power dynamics. And I think that means that managers have a responsibility to their direct reports for many things. I think a few things include ensuring that their direct reports are set up with the right opportunities that help them to grow and stretch in appropriate ways. I think that means they have to learn to give effective feedback, and feedback across lines of difference. There's so much research out there that talks about how that is especially tough. Like if you are, let's say, a white manager giving feedback to a few of your direct reports who identifies people of color, there's a lot of research out there that shows about how that can go all kinds of wrong. In many ways. I think managers have to advocate for their direct reports as well. And then I think they have to consider how their own biases directly impact their own management style and their expectations of direct reports. A concrete example is a few years ago, I had an individual share with me that they believed their manager wanted them to emulate exactly their style. This manager wanted this individual to emulate exactly their talking style, their presentation style. And this individual felt like if they didn't, it would reflect negatively on them. And I really think we can't be as effective people leaders if we don't consider what equity and power dynamics look like in our roles. And so managers have an individual accountability for their own learning and growing in this space. So if, your management leadership or style has elements that could exclude people, that has elements of you perpetuating certain ideas of, what the perfect leadership archetype or what the perfect archetype of an employee is, we have to consider the ways in which that can be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say this all the time too, but I truly believe there are no born people leaders. You have to be intentional about it. And the people that you are leading or who are on your team are all uniquely different, and they have different needs. And you really need to actively listening, to going back to your earlier point as well, in terms of just getting that feedback and, receiving constructive feedback as well. So, and building trust amongst individuals too is so important too. I wanted to dive in a little bit to kind of what you're doing at Clever as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion too, and what the company is really focused on as well, especially with your role too.
Yeah, I will say I think it's first very important to acknowledge where we are as an organization. I mentioned that there's been DEI work ongoing here for the last several years, and it's largely been led by BIPOC folks and folks from other marginalized communities across the organization. And so I like to debunk the myth that, there's kind of this idea that DEI work only happens when you hire a full-time person for it. That's not true.
Yeah.
I would say there's been a lot of amazing work that has happened before I came, and a lot of folks who have been so involved in the work who continue to influence me and inform the direction that we take. I will say we've made some progress in the last few years, but we're certainly not where we want to be, and we have a long way to go, I think, as do most organizations in the tech space. We have some critical work that we need to do around our own internal staff representation, as well as our own internal processes and practices. I'll say that where we started, though, in our initial founding, our founders built the company with a mission of educational equity. And that often started with some of our product work. I think once we got to a certain point, we had to further evolve our efforts around DE&I. And so now we're focused on DE&I in 3 different realms. So the first one is continuing, this product work to ensure that we're having equitable impact of our product. And I think every company kind of starts from this place, and we're not necessarily unique in that sense. But we really want to understand the impact that our product has on teachers and students across the country and how we actually apply a lens of equity here. I would say that as we grew and scaled as an organization, we also knew that we had to start focusing very seriously on creating an equitable organization internally. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of the second realm of work that we do, is this idea of how do we be an equitable organization internally. Our long-term goal is that our representation has as much diversity as the schools that we serve. And that's really important for us because we do serve the US K-12 student and teacher population. So it's really important for us to mirror that diversity that exists. And then I think we also hold up a mirror to our organization in other ways, including, what are our practices, policies, and systems. This work also includes, how do we build a DEI ecosystem infrastructure of sorts where our employee resource groups, our DEI leadership committee, our executive team, our managers, and many other stakeholders in this work are clear about the roles and responsibilities that they have around fostering DEI and ensuring that this actually lives in our company across everything that we do. And then third, the third kind of realm is, I think, we are uniquely positioned in school districts and other education companies to surface equity in the conversation. So, how are we becoming more equitable entities as like a broader education and ed tech ecosystem? And so I think we're doing a lot of learning from both our customers and our business partners, and also sharing a lot about what we're doing with our customers and business partners too. So that's a little bit of what we're focused on.
There's a lot going on, which is really good.
There's a lot going on.
But I think that goes back to your earlier point as well, that it's not just about attracting underrepresented talent, it's about retaining and promotion and about systems as well too. So it sounds like you're doing a lot of systems thinking around that as well. I think one of the questions that a lot of people continue to ask is, just like, how do you measure incremental change and, diversity, equity, and inclusion, like progress, especially when we know that change doesn't happen overnight, but you do want to measure things as well.
Yeah, I think measurement is a super important piece of this. I think one way to put the focus on measurement in particular is to build this work directly into company goals and metrics. So just as we measure, like if you're launching a new product or if you're, trying to grow a user base, like we measure all those things, right? And so, and we put them often in like this company-wide plan of, OKRs or whatever it might be, whatever a company might has. And so I think it's really important to build this work directly into wherever your larger company goals and metrics live, and to build out what that might look like. And then I think, it's also important to pull data where you can at every turn. I think both qualitative and quantitative data are very important. Sometimes I think we, in the tech world, we anchor really heavily on quantitative data. And yes, important. And also I think when it comes to DEI work, qualitative data is just super, super critical. And so pulling that data where you can at every turn for so much of, what folks might do internally. So how are you pulling that data for growth and development, promotion? How are you pulling it for recruiting? How are you pulling it for engagement? There are all different ways to think about what it means to pull data. And also, I think really just coming from thinking about measurement from a place of, are the folks who are most marginalized in our organization better off than they were yesterday or a year ago or whatever your measure of time might be, but really anchoring around some like really large questions as well, about, what is the purpose of this work? Why are we doing it? And really anchoring around that.
Absolutely. What is the purpose of this work? And if the question is no, are they not? Or if the answer is not right now, but this is what we could do to get better. I liked your example of just like the product roadmap and just like measuring the success of the product of a company as well through OKRs, like the odds of a company starting off with product A on day one, and then day 100, it's going to be a completely different product. So you need to continue iterating on it, like testing it, feedback, and it's part of the process as well. So I think that it definitely makes sense.
Yeah, it totally is. And I would say you have to constantly evaluate. And so, I think you have to constantly build in teaching, for example, we talk a lot about, summative and formative assessments. And I kind of think similarly, right? When we think about DEI work, like we have to have periodic, potentially smaller assessments of various different elements. And we also have to have those really larger assessments of all of the efforts going on and how they're interacting with one another. Are we actually moving a system as we say we want to?
Absolutely. Are there any other elements or things that you really want to emphasize that are important to create that culture of belonging, culture of inclusion as well, especially for historically marginalized employees?
Yes. I think it's really important to interrogate the idea of like bringing yourself to work.
Yes.
I feel like it's been such a proclaimed mantra in the tech industry. You can come here and you can bring your full self to work.
Yes.
And I think we really have to examine how it applies in today's current context. And so it's really important to me at any organization that I work in, at Clever today. And I know it's important to folks at my organization as well to really understand what this means deeply. And I'll make this a bit personal too, right? So, as an Asian American woman and woman of color, I can't walk into a workplace and just forget my identity and the histories that I carry with me. I can't pretend like systemic racism and sexism doesn't happen every day and continues to have devastating consequences. I can't forget that like a month ago, a white man walked into spas in Atlanta and murdered Asian women. So to me, bringing my full self to work would mean that I feel empowered to name what's top of mind for me, and not just on days where tragedies happen.
Right.
But every day, and that my opinions, ideas, and feelings are valued, heard, and seen. It would mean as well that, there wouldn't be an expectation of me always necessarily talking about what's up for me or pressure to talk about what's up for me, especially as we think about like racialized trauma and the very real racial violence that exists in this country. But that there is a deep mindfulness across the company of what might be up for other people. And then I think what's also really important is it means that we're not asking people, especially folks who are from marginalized communities, to assimilate to what might be the dominant culture of an organization, and that we expand our culture to ensure all employees are valued, heard, and seen. So, for example, it's not my leadership style to speak up in a meeting just for the sake of speaking, then that should be wholly respected and affirmed. And people should realize that I might be exercising my leadership and my voice in other ways that may not be as visible as we might often think about it, in the most visible way. So I really think it's important to examine this idea within a company culture. And to like think about it on a deeper level. Like when we say bring yourself to work, what does that really mean deeply?
Exactly. I definitely agree with you. I was watching a TED Talk the other day about bringing your full self to work. And if it's an idealistic view, which I definitely think that it is as well, and then like, how can we really take steps to get there? And I think what you said in terms of valued, heard, and seen for employees is so, so important. And I think there is a real responsibility for leaders and team members to really, really foster that as well, especially right now, because we are still in a global pandemic and everybody is going through something as well, and we need to acknowledge that. Are there any other trends that you're seeing in terms of DEI or just generally that really companies and individuals need to be aware of in order to be successful in the future? I know one of the things you mentioned was just having dedicated resources to DEI and really investing in, because it is a full-time person's job, as well as grassroots company culture. But are there any other trends that you're seeing that you would like to share with the folks who are listening?
Yes, I recently read this article, I think it was in the Washington Post, but it was about how millennials and Gen Z in particular really care about DE&I in workplaces, and that, they're not interested in the disingenuous DE&I or checking off a box kind of DE&I, but real sustained DEI efforts and initiatives that will lead to a different world and will lead to actual change in our workspaces. And so I think as companies become more populated with Gen Z, that's really important to pay attention to, the Gen Z and millennials. And, I'm a millennial as well, and it's important to me. So, but, I think if companies don't have DE&I efforts, period, or if their DE&I efforts feel performative or they feel like they're disingenuous, I think it's a signal to people about what you care about. And I think the incoming generation of folks in the workplace can totally see right through it. And so I think it's an important trend that we should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. People can read verbal and nonverbal signals. And I would
Yes.
argue more oftentimes than not can tell if you're being authentic or if you're just saying words to say words, or like you said, speak up in a meeting to just speak up and say, okay, like I checked the box, I participated, I wrote this company statement, for example.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so as much as we can live into the idea of, we are genuinely committed to making this work happen, and you don't have to know all the answers. Like, I don't think any company has it right. I don't think any company has all the answers, and no leaders have all the answers either. But like, how do we even be humble about that? How do we stand in our humility? How do we own mistakes? All of that can help to build a more authentic way of doing this work.
Absolutely. This is more of a personal question, but if you could pick what your legacy would be, what would you want it to be?
Oh gosh, my legacy. Okay. I think that I lived into courage around fighting for equity, and that I never betrayed my own principles and values in the process.
That's pretty good.
Okay.
I think that's a great legacy. And I think your work speaks to a lot of that already as well. So I was just curious too. I know that we have talked a lot today about just diversity, equity, and inclusion, being really intentional about strategies and supporting people and, being really authentic in that. Is there anything else that you would like to share that maybe we haven't touched on, or reemphasize a point that you really hope people take away from our conversation today?
I don't think so. I mean, just if I could requote Grace Lee Boggs again,
yes.
I think, starting where I ended is, a different world is really possible. And how do we, I think Grace Lee Boggs, she talks a lot about like, how do we expand our imagination for what is required in this moment? And I think this is a moment for us expanding our imagination and thinking about what a different kind of world is actually in fact possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amie. It was so nice speaking to you on this Friday afternoon. Appreciate you taking the time, and I hope that you have a fabulous weekend.
Thanks, Christina. It was great to be here.
Yes, absolutely. At AllVoices, we believe in the empowerment of everyone to speak up and believe it's a requirement in order for everyone to succeed at the organization. See you soon.